This is Beyond the Numbers, examining the racial impact of affirmative action's demise in college admissions by Dylan Young. Getting into a good college is more about just earning a degree. It's about opening doors to opportunities that can shape your future. A strong college provides not only quality education, but also access to valuable networks, resources, and experiences that can set you apart in your career and personal growth. It's where you can explore your passions, build lifelong connections, and gain skills and confidence to chase your dreams. Additionally, affirmative action in college admissions has been a cornerstone of U.S. higher education policy for decades, purposed to create opportunities for those underrepresented through historical facts. Conversely, the consideration of race-conscious policies has inflated controversy, especially with regards to the way in which their consideration may affect Asian Americans. The debate has raged more seriously in recent years than ever, with legal challenges and public discourse casting attacks on fairness in college admissions, most notably in the case of Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard lawsuit. The plaintiffs claim that the admissions policies put Asian Americans at a disadvantage. The ruling of the court case was that the Harvard University race-conscious policies violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. This ruling repealed affirmative action in college admissions. I want to research this subject because of how much it relates to me. I'm an Asian American high school student and I'm applying for colleges next year. So I want to figure out how the removal of affirmative action affects me. I'm also connected to the overall study of Asian discrimination as I've studied it in the past. The race-conscious policies in college admissions that promote diversity, also known as affirmative action, has just recently been overturned in the court case of Students for Fair Education versus Harvard. But what does this mean? There are numerous opinions about affirmative action that are for it and that are against it. Grossman identifies arguments that criticize affirmative action by saying that college admissions should be based on merit alone and race shouldn't be a factor. Additionally, people claim that affirmative action goes against its purpose of racial equality by discriminating Asians through a process called negative action, where highly qualified Asian applicants are turned down because affirmative action policies prioritizing racial diversity over merit. On the other hand, Hart describes two ideas of interest convergence in critical race theory that criticizes the removal of affirmative action. Hart said that the removal of affirmative action was an act of interest convergence, where white people in power framed Asians as victims of the system in order to dismantle affirmative action, to maintain white dominance in higher education, since affirmative action historically has lowered white acceptance rates. Hart also criticizes affirmative action using the critical race theory, stating that affirmative action only regulates individual bias and fails to correct racism that has been deeply embedded in social systems and policies. The model minority myth is one of the dominant themes in the discussion of Asian Americans in affirmative action. This stereotype, characterizing Asian Americans as uniformly successful, particularly in academics, carries both positive and negative implications for college admissions. While on one hand, it frames a representation in academic excellence. However, according to Moses, it creates a narrative of Asian American overrepresentation in higher education that might well justify their discrimination in college admissions. A study from Chai and Wesley show how stereotypical Asian Americans who excel in STEM are discriminated against in college admissions due to being perceived as more nerdy and unsocial than their white counterparts. The study had college admission officers who were randomly assigned to view a shortened version of college applications. The participants rated the students whose application they saw according to the likelihood of getting into the college, social competence, academic competence, and contribution to the college's diversity. The stereotypical Asian American student was perceived to be less likely to be accepted into college and had a lower perceived social competence rate than the other three students. Additionally, in general, Grossman and Tesler discovered that Asians statistically face higher rejection rates than their white peers, despite having higher GPAs and test scores. Tesler also states that Asians partake in supplementary activities such as test prep, academic enrichment programs, and more AP classes. Tesler says that this actually hurts Asian American applicants because it puts an overemphasis on their academics and traditional achievements, which categorizes them as stereotypical Asian American applicants and does not let them stand out. Here are two examples where the elimination of race-conscious admissions reduced diversity in elite universities. First is when Texas banned affirmative action in 1996 in the case of Hawkwood versus Texas. Black and Hispanic enrollment immediately dropped from top institutions like UT Austin and Texas A&M. They implemented the top 10% plan that guaranteed admission to Texas's public universities for those in the top 10% of their class. This was an attempt to address the decline in diversity, but it couldn't restore previous diversity levels, especially in competitive fields like STEM. Similarly, California's Proposition 209, which removed affirmative action for UCs in 1998, caused a sharp decrease in minority enrollment at UC Berkeley and UCLA, creating a long-lasting cascade effect with negative economic consequences for underrepresented students. Long says that both cases highlight that race-neutral policies alone cannot maintain the diversity that affirmative action provides. Enrollment rates closely reflect admission trends because universities carefully manage admissions based off historical yield rates, which is the percentage of accepted students who ultimately enroll into the school. For example, if affirmative action policies had traditionally helped underrepresented minorities gain admissions into selective schools, then a decline in their admission rates post-policy removal would naturally lead to lower enrollment numbers. This indeed has been the case in California following Proposition 209 and in Texas following Hopwood versus Texas, as underrepresented minorities enrollment in elite universities declined significantly following changes in admission practices rather than student choice alone. And now for my gap. Because affirmative action has just recently been removed in less than 2 years ago, only the class of 2028 has been affected by it. Colleges are still releasing their acceptance demographics, and not many studies have been done on the removal of affirmative action. My research question is, how has the removal of affirmative action in college admissions affected the demographic representation of Asian Americans in the class of 2028 at U.S. universities, and how is this shift compared to previous admission cycles under race-conscious policies? The present study employs a quantitative research design to examine the impact of the removal of affirmative action on enrollment rates in higher education. Initially, I aim to analyze admission rates by extracting publicly available data from official college websites across the United States. However, admissions data was too restricted and not enough data could be found for the study. Due to the unavailability of admissions data, I pivoted my data collection to enrollment rates. My rationale behind this decision was justified earlier, that enrollment rates is a good reflection of admissions. I gathered data dating back to 2010 in order to capture the overall trend of demographic change from years prior to the policy change. I also researched the trend for Hispanics, Black African Americans, whites, and people who chose not to display their race. While researching affirmative action, I discovered a New York Times article that had processed information on enrollment data. I contacted the journalist of the article, Atish Bhatia, and asked for the raw data. This effort proved successful, resulting in me receiving a spreadsheet containing enrollment rates from 2010 to 2024 from 59 different universities. I took this data and found the average enrollment rate for each demographic across all 59 universities for each year. This allowed me to find the average percent change, which would be the trend that I compared the enrollment rate of the class of 2028 to. Ultimately, this analysis aimed to assess whether the policy change benefited or hurt racial demographics in higher education. A similar methodology was employed in the study Global Trends in Higher Education, a comparative analysis of enrollment and quality assurance mechanisms. This research utilized a quantitative comparative analysis of enrollment patterns across various countries, gathering data from official sources and analyzing trends over time. This study provides a nuanced understanding of how affirmative action policies or the removal shape racial demographics in higher education. Findings. My data showed that in the 13 years prior to the removal of affirmative action, Asians, Black or African Americans, and Hispanics enrollment rates had been steadily increasing each year. On the other hand, the enrollment rates of whites and those who chose not to identify their race had been steadily going down. There were three main discoveries when reviewing the effects of removal of affirmative action. Firstly, Asian and white enrollment rates stayed the same. Second, there was a decrease in both Black and Hispanic enrollment. Lastly, there was a big increase in the number of people who chose not to display their race. There was some outliers in the data as well, one being Johns Hopkins University, where they had an increase of Asian enrollment by nearly 15% after the policy change. This is interesting because it shows how a restructured application review led to more academically competitive Asians getting accepted into the university. Here are two examples of the graphs that I had from my process data. The left is a trend for Hispanic students, and the right is for unknown race students. The sudden decrease in Hispanic enrollment raises questions about whether affirmative action is needed to maintain diversity or not. Also, the sharp increase in those choosing not to display their race suggests something that I'll talk about in the discussion. Discussion. One of the most surprising findings in this analysis is that following the removal of affirmative action, white and Asian enrollment rates remained stable, while Black and Hispanic enrollment declined. Many opponents of affirmative action argued that its removal would benefit both white and Asian applicants, under the belief that race-conscious policies primarily disadvantage these groups in favor of underrepresented minorities. If affirmative action has significantly disadvantaged Asians and white applicants, we would have expected their enrollment rates to increase once these policies were eliminated. Instead, their enrollment remained largely unchanged. Kinsler and Ransom suggested that factors beyond affirmative action, such as socioeconomic status, academic preparation, and legacy admissions, may play a larger role in shaping enrollment outcomes. Additionally, these shifts raise critical questions about the role of race-conscious policies in shaping access to higher education. Prior to affirmative action's removal, the increasing trajectory towards prior to affirmative action's removal, the increasing enrollment of underrepresented minorities indicated a positive trajectory towards greater diversity. However, Long argues the decline in Black and Hispanic students' enrollment post-policy change suggests that race-conscious policies played a crucial role in maintaining representation for these groups. One of the more subtle yet significant trends in the post-affirmative action enrollment data is the rise in students identifying as unknown race. A compelling suggestion is that many of these applicants could be Asian students who deliberately chose not to disclose their racial identity, fearing that identifying as Asian might disadvantage them in the admissions process. This researcher also highlights how Asian applicants have adjusted their college application strategies in response to perceived biases, such as downplaying stereotypical Asian extracurricular activities or avoiding self-racial identification. The data shows that after affirmative action was struck down, Black and Hispanic enrollment rates declined. This suggests that the removal of race-conscious policies primarily impacted underrepresented minorities, leading to a redistribution of available spots. Since white and Asian enrollments remained stable, the spots left open by the decline in Black and Hispanic students were filled by applicants in the unknown race category, which potentially was made up of primarily Asian students who concealed their racial identity. This study reveals effects of affirmative action removal on college enrollment. While white and Asian enrollment remained stable, Black and Hispanic enrollment declined, and the unknown race category increased. There is a suggestion that some Asian applicants concealed their race to avoid potential biases, indirectly benefiting from the policy change. The biggest limitation of this study is its inability to prove the hypothesis without data on the makeup of the unknown race category, and it calls for more research. Additionally, as stated before, enrollment rate is not 100% accurate of the representation of admissions, and the way college is calculated also varies. Lastly, further research is needed to understand how race-neutral policies impact applicant behavior and diversity in higher education. All in all, it is clear that affirmative action played a key role in maintaining representation for underrepresented groups. But more is needed to be known about race-neutral policies in order to maximize diversity while maintaining fairness in college admissions.
How did your initial exploration of the scholarly conversation lead to your final research question?
When I engaged in scholarly conversation, I saw that there were people who believed that affirmative action had benefited for underrepresented minorities and diversity, and some that say it disadvantaged them. So I wanted to use my research to go into depth and answer that question of the effects of removal of affirmative action.
How did the limitations of your method or data influence your new understanding?
The biggest limitation in my data was that I used enrollment instead of admissions, but I used in my literature review how enrollment rates closely reflects admissions. And could you repeat the last part of the question, actually?
How did it influence your understanding of the topic?
And yeah, it just made me approach the results I had with a grain of salt, because it's not the exact same, but it is pretty similar since enrollment rates was close to admissions.
If you could revisit your research process, What would you do differently and why?
I would have probably gone with enrollment rates from the start, because instead I started with admissions and that was really hard and wasted a lot of time. But I felt like if I started with enrollment rates, I could have spent more time on analyzing that and going through the statistics on that.